So, the buffs, the card changes, the nerfs. This is it, guys. Alright, Darius, +1 health. This change is almost meaningless. This is a really terrible, okay, so the thing about Darius is, like, he's alright. He's not great, you know, he's seen some experimentation and some kind of like spider aggro. Shadow Isles like Noxus sort of like control harrowing combo decks. You know, it's been alright. For the most part, though, Darius loses to things like Will of Ionia or even stuff like Frostbite. In reality, the +1 health doesn't really matter on him because when he's flipped, you're usually ending the game that turn anyway, so whether he's surviving that point of combat or not doesn't really matter. This is going to have a really hard time making a difference. That being said, I will say, you know, the biggest thing to take away is that at the end of the day, a lot of cards can suddenly see play just based on like minor changes, and I don't think that this change is going to help Darius, but Darius is one of the cards that, like, a slight shift in the meta could actually make this card be used a lot more. Anivia goes down from 7 to 6, right? This is a big deal, kind of. It's a bigger deal than Darius. All right, so Anivia has had a problem for a little while. People started saying that, wait, isn't this just a 7 mana misfortune? And, like, the answer is, like, kind of yes. It kind of is actually like a 7 mana misfortune. So at the end of the day, it costs 1 less. Hey, that's a big deal, but it still needs to be enlightened to come back, so it's still going to be pretty awkward until then. Ultimately, like, you know, -1 mana is like a absolutely gigantic change for anything, and I actually do expect it to, you know, feel different with Anivia. But Anivia feels like it's lacking just a little bit more. There's not enough reason to like run stuff like Ramp to try to rush Enlightenment. Turn 10 is just a little late, especially considering then, like, you know, current meta and stuff like that. You really want to be playing for later turns. So earlier turns. What am I talking about? You really want to be like trying to force the game out before turn 10 usually. So depending on the meta, maybe Anivia could kind of come back if the meta slows down a lot. That's going to be the one thing Anivia needs to see play. Ultimately, the -1 cost will help her feel less bad, but she's still not going to be competitive alone with that. Braum goes from 3 to 4 cost and from 0 to 1 power with the added text, the first time I survive damage, summon a mighty Poro. So Braum is now a 4 mana 1/5. So it costs 1 more mana. It gets a free power, but you get a mighty Poro for free. This could actually be really strong. This is a little nuts. I will say. And you know, this is so the thing about Braum is basically, I think it's really important to evaluate cards and exchanges by how they are trading, right? This is like a really big deal. Okay, you look at Braum, and before Braum and Braum decks especially were like basically a simple, you know, okay, if the opponent has like hard removal, I lose. And if they don't have hard removal, I win, right? When you buff a Braum, you know, I play Braum, I play Take Heart. If you have Will of Ionia, you win. If you don't have Will or Vengeance or, I don't know, Detain, then, you know, you're good, right? Or maybe some like super aggro strategy that's going to kill me, right? Because Braum is kind of like infinite value. But now, when I play Braum, I get a free Mighty Poro. I buff him with Take Heart, and then you Will of Ionia Braum. I got a free Mighty Poro out of that. That's really not necessarily that bad, right? Like, that's still a pretty positive change. Our normal commitment to balance, many of the card changes this patch are part of the more focused efforts to address issues or opportunities across several groups of cards, specifically Epics, Freljord, or Steal from deck effects. So the overall consensus with this patch is that the devs are saying they feel like Freljord is a little weak and they're buffing it or making it better in some ways. Now, I don't agree with that. I think that Freljord is literally arguably the strongest region in the game right now. I mean, probably less so now than like 2 weeks ago, but Freljord is actually hitting like the most tier 1 decks out of anything. It is, at the very least, one of the stronger regions in the game. I think it's the strongest. I would say it's the strongest. But this is the kind of thing that's a bit concerning, right? Sejuani is strong, Freljord is weak. Okay, sure. There's a few specific things that make Freljord strong. Yes. And most of it is weak. But that's kind of like, that doesn't really matter that much, because when you combine those things together, then it gets even more stronger, right? That's kind of the problem. But yes, no. Freljord is strong because of a couple of specific cards. So, Jinx. Jinx gets a bit of a buff in this case. Her rocket goes down to 1 cost. This is actually a pretty big deal. Her rocket being like 1 mana now, suddenly you can use this a lot more. I will say that now that Boom Rookie has been nerfed, the idea of like aggro PNZ has been greatly nerfed. I think the biggest thing here is that, read Braum level 2. Yeah, Braum level 2 also gets +1 power. Braum level 2 just gets +1/+1. Sorry, I glossed over that. He got reworked to +1/+1. So Jinx basically is a card that has just been sort of like, for the first part of the game, it was sort of carrying like aggro PNZ along with Boom Rookie. Boom Rookie, I will say, has felt so bad since it got nerfed to 3 health. I personally don't see Jinx making splashes. I don't think that's going to be big. But what I will say is that this is definitely going to be something that brings more experimentation into that. And I think overall, like, nerf to Boom Rookie and then buff to Jinx is like a healthy pattern here. I really like that approach. Jinx definitely will feel a lot more playable, and she's pretty close. She really is. Like, I don't expect her to make waves, but she just needs to hit like maybe like 1 more high value discard support card or something like that. Genevieve Elmhart gets +1/+1. What does this card do again? I'm summoned to give other allies +1/+1 this round. Okay, so Genevieve Elmhart is interesting. This card is theoretically very powerful. When you look at this card, you're like, wow, that's nuts. And then you play it and you're like, wow, there's one flaw with this card, which is that it's competing for Cytherea the Bold in my 6-mana Demacia slot. And that's rough. It's hard to compete with Cytherea, man. It really is. But this buff is pretty crazy. I will say, this buff is pretty crazy now. Like, +1/+1 is a really big deal. This actually will see experimentation, like, over the Cytherea slot. I'm not saying it will be better than Cytherea, but people will actually try it out. This is like a really, really big deal. Like a really, really huge one. Because yes, even Cytherea will actually, people will try this card. So Unyielding Spirit goes from burst to fast. This basically kills the card. This card is suddenly non-competitive. I agree with this change. This is just kind of like, it turns it into like sort of like a meme card, like a super all-in meme card, which is probably the healthiest thing for this concept. So this is pretty much what I would have done. I like this. Basilisk Rider goes from I guess I should clarify. Yeah, this is probably not a competitive card anymore, so this is not going to be seen in decks, like competitive decks, right? Straight up. So Basilisk Rider, 2 health to 3 health. Now, this is still not going to help Basilisk Rider at the end of the day. Basilisk Rider has been just like a really weak card the entire game. It's been like, even like in the early days of the game, it was like a worse version of Crowd Favorite, basically. That was like really awkward, and even like Crowd Favorite is kind of like not even seeing that much play anymore. That style of aggro with like kind of early overwhelm has kind of been somewhat phased out because it's just a little too counterable. So Basilisk Rider, you know, when you hit the Allegiance, it's going to be a 6/4, which is kind of nice, but overall the Noxus Allegiance is going to be really hard to hit. The thing about Allegiances, here's the thing about Allegiances. You need to be running a high density of cards from a specific region, which means it needs to be effectively reaching a card pool within its archetype that is broadly accessible. And here's the paradox, because with an idea like aggro, you are basically going for a narrow range of cards. There's not that many cards in the entire game that are going to be fast enough to meet the demands for what your deck wants to do. So the idea of like a very aggressive, like properly aggro Allegiance card sort of doesn't make sense in and of itself, right? Overall, I don't see Basilisk Rider seeing like too much play. Captain Pharaon, huge buff, gigantic buff for Captain Pharaon. Instead of transforming all the cards in your hands into decimates, it now just creates 3 decimates in your hand. That's a gigantic buff, and yet this card still feels kind of bad. How is that even possible? How is that even possible? In theory, this looks really good, and it actually will see experimentation. There's 2 styles of decks. It's like a control Noxus card, right? Somewhat. So that's going to be like Swain, or maybe like Nox SI has seen some like kind of like control mixed togethers, right? That has been a thing. Run this over Leviathan. I mean, Leviathan is kind of there for the whole Swain thing, right? Like, I don't know if this is like a run this over Leviathan. Better Darius. Well, I agree that it's a better Darius. It kind of has to be a better Darius. Why is this not just Nox Ledros? Well, it effectively is. The decimates are gonna, take a lot of mana to cast, and they're gonna be pretty slow. Usually, these are the rounds where the game's closing out. I will say, evaluating a card like Captain Fron is going to be entirely contingent on the speed of the meta. So let's talk about this a little bit. So basically, for the last month we've had since the last balance patch, we've been in a pretty aggressive meta. Like, actually very aggressive. Things have been going very fast, and in a meta like that, this Captain Fron just wouldn't really work out. Now, you go back one meta back before the last balance patch, before we had, the nerfs to like some of the OP Demacia cards like Ranger and Boom Kariki. Yeah, there was Burn, but apart from Burn, like all the other decks were really slow. You had a bunch of like super slow Shadow Isles decks, Ionia, Demacia with like Karma decks were all over. And in a meta like that, Captain Fron could make sense. At the end of the day, it just comes down to like how fast the meta is, period, right? I think Fron is a pretty competitive card. I will say, the buff is absolutely gargantuan to him, and he is going to see some fringe play for sure. Like, this is a card that exists on the competitive level, right? This is a card that you can actually be like, oh, wow, yeah, this is an actual card. Fron Karma. Yeah, it's not impossible to be like combining Fron with Karma. It's like doubling up decimates. Can be sort of efficient. I don't think there's gonna be enough control tools in Ionia and Noxus in that together, unfortunately. Aurora Borealis goes from 7 to 6. This doesn't change the card at all. Poro Herder goes from 4 to 2, well, it's a rework, so it goes to a 2-mana 2/3, and when I'm summoned to draw 1 Poro. So it no longer draws 2, it draws 1. This is like kind of a nerf. Overall, this card kind of liked being a 4-mana chonker that drew 2 cards. This is kind of a weird one. Like, now you have to draw this on turn 2. I don't think this is really going to help like the Poro archetype. She Who Wanders added keyword regeneration. Complete non-factor. They Who Endure. This card is still bad. They Who Endure goes from 6 to 7. I think this is a pretty big nerf, for sure. I will say They Who Endure is a card that will still probably exist on the competitive level. A lot of you guys are saying They Who Endure is still going to be like OP. I don't know if I would say this card is OP necessarily. I think this card feeds off of certain dynamics. Like, I mean, this card is OP when you combine it with like Keeper and Caretaker, right? In and of itself, it really needs those other cards to do anything at all. I think that the nerf to 7 mana is going to be a pretty big one. It rarely gets played on 6. Okay, so that is a good point. Yes, it does rarely get played on 6, but there's still going to be many situations in those late game spots where that 1 mana will make a difference, even if you're not playing it on turn 6, right? It's going to like a lot harder to use They Who Endure plus Atrocity on the same turn, that kind of thing. There's definitely a lot more limitations for this on 7. We'll see how this pans out. I do think this card is still going to exist on the competitive level, but I think this is a pretty big nerf. Like, this is a nerf that you will feel. Okay, Red and Shadowblade. So Red and Shadowblade has gotten a rework as well. It is now a 4/3/3 quick attack. Strike, create a Shadow Fiend in hand. So this card is almost as useless as the old one. This is like, I don't get this card. I really don't, actually. Like, what? I don't understand what this card is trying to do. So it's a 4-mana 3/3 Usually 4 mana is like where you're not gonna really be able to attack in for free anyway. Like they might have a blocker for this. Like boy. So there's a lot of situations where it'll die right away to something like, you know, Get Excited or Grasp. There's a lot of situations where you'll play it and you won't be able to attack because they'll have something that can block and kill it. And then even after you like dodged both of those, the payoff is really minor. It's like in the perfect situation, you play it, you start attacking, it's totally fine. You're drawing like one or two shadow, probably like 2 Shadow Fiends. It's like a worse Zed. Yeah, it's like a, yeah, when you compare this to Zed, it's actually oh god, oh Jesus, I wasn't even comparing it to Zed. Yeah, that's yeah, that's awkward. Alright, so I don't know about that one. This one, however, Jay Medarda, this is big. Goes to a 6/4/4 when I'm targeted and survive, draw 1. He did lose the elusive keyword. He does not have that anymore. But a 6 mana 4/4 when I'm targeted and survive, draw 1. Suddenly, you can just run this card and things. Like, I don't know exactly like how much faith I have in this card, but looking at him, there's a lot that we can turn him into. Auctioneer, yeah, it's like Gadgets and Auctioneer. There's a lot of combos with this. You can use it with Draven and Draven's Axes. Raptor made a deck a long time ago that did that. You can use it with like some of the Demacia package, like some of the barrier stuff for single combat. You can run this in, yeah, like the Lee Sin style decks, like Lee Sin PNZ can work pretty well. There's a ton of like cheap things. You're getting like a draw 2 off of like your Sonic Wave combo, right? That's gonna be pretty big. Transfusion, yeah, sure, Transfusion in like that Draven style deck you could maybe run. There's a lot of applications for this. Who's gonna target this garbage seriously? Well, you are. That's the point. You're the one that's gonna draw your own cards, right? So Escaped Abomination. This card, basically, this is the Cursed Keeper token, and it's now Cursed Keeper is making a 4/3 instead. So I think this is a really good nerf. This is exactly what I would have done. Cursed Keeper is a card that has been kind of inherently OP for a long time, and it's just been waiting for like a combo piece to come in at the right value at the right time for it to be just nuts. And we see that in Caretaker kind of being the tipping point, although there are other factors. And Escaped Abomination has always been kind of like just overstated for what Keeper represents, so it kind of needed to come down in this way. I think that Keeper's still going to be a perfectly competitive card. It will still see those same spots in those same decks, but it'll be at least like you will feel this like when you're playing like the Keeper aggro decks, and when your Keeper Butcher is like a 4/3 instead of a 4/4. That really will matter. Like that will affect the outcome of a lot of games. So overall, between those two nerfs, between the They Who Endure nerf and the Escape Abomination nerf, that style of like They Who Endure sort of like tempo deck, it's still going to be pretty good. Neither of these nerfs are completely damning to the deck, but I expect that deck to be more of a tier 2 deck than a tier 1 deck after everything's all said and done. The Harrowing. Cost goes to 9. So it's a pretty big deal, I guess. Harrowing is a card that... I do want to make one point with Harrowing. Back in the day, this card used to res everything from either side of the field, right? It used to res opponent's cards and it used to res your cards. Now it only reses your cards. I want to point out that this change not only changed the power level of the card, but the concept of the card. You have to understand that now this card is not really a low synergy finisher, but a high synergy finisher. This is now a card that you kind of need your deck to be empowering. Whereas before, you could just plop it on whatever, and it's just like, yeah, let's win the game here. You kind of need to set it up. That's a big deal. You need to be playing maybe like Hecarim, or maybe just some big things. I could see stuff like Darkwater Scourge. Like, you do need to make sure your Harrowing is getting good value, right? Ash, yeah, Zombie Ash with Harrowing. That was a deck in the past. That kind of thing. Like, this is a card that needs to be enabled, right? At 9 mana, it feels a lot better. It does. Particularly, some of you guys are pointing out that in Ionia versions, if you're against the Ionia mirror on the side, then you can wait until turn 10 and then hold Harrowing plus Deny to beat hands of the opponent that have Deny, which is kind of nice. You know, that will actually matter sometimes. Overall, the harrowing just comes down to, like, hitting the right deck, right? Like, do we think the state of stuff like Ashe, Zombie Ashe, or potentially stuff like, you know, Hecarim is going to make it worth it to run 9 mana harrowing? Could be. I think it could be, right? But I think the biggest thing about the harrowing is just that, like, if it doesn't have one of those decks that it attaches to, it really can't be a good card. This is actually something that is going to be seeing play in some decks. I think that, you know, Ashe, Zombie Ashe will make attempts to come back. Maybe that'll work. You know, Freljord has some pretty sweet tools now. I could definitely see a deck like Zombie Ashe possibly being up to like tier 2. That could definitely happen, right? I do think that some people are slightly overhyping this, though. I think that the harrowing has bigger problems than its mana cost. Dreg Dredgers gets nerfed to 1 power. This one's a little weird. It didn't feel like Deep was particularly OP, but I guess it sends the Deep archetype like more in line, and I'm sure they had like a really high play rate at low ranks. So overall, Dreg Dredgers, yeah, it's just a bit of a nerf to Deep. Deep decks still have to run the card. Eat that ass. Yeah. Poor Dreg Dredgers, dude. Didn't do anything, and they just get absolutely nerfed. This, like, you'll feel this playing Deep too, but you'll still have to run Dreg Dredgers, and that's kind of like the worst thing. So basically, it doesn't really change much about how you play or run Deep. Like this is pretty like low impact. It just makes Deep decks a bit weaker because you still have to run this card. It doesn't change like the build really. When is Meta Monday coming? So that's a very good question. It's gonna come tomorrow with the patch. I'm gonna do one of the sort of like semi-predictive ones where I, you know, go by the stats we've had recently and then try to extrapolate a bit off of these changes and sort of predict where the meta might end up being with some prediction decks. Mind Meld. Mind Meld goes down to 7 cost. So, god damn it. Mind Meld is really bad, okay? I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry, but it is. Like, as much as I would love to look at this card and be like, oh my god, it's the Mind Meld meta. We go in and we make a full spell deck and we play all the spells, we meld big, and we fuck shit up. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work out like that. Like, there's just so many problems with this card. It's just so clunky. Slow speed finishers are no good. It kind of like, it incentivizes you to run a lot of units by its payoff, but it incentivizes you to run a lot of spells by its condition for that payoff, so it's kind of like stretching you in 2 different directions that don't make sense. It's in a region that frankly doesn't really make much sense. I don't understand why this card's in Bilgewater. That's also just kind of weird. Nothing about this card really makes too much sense. It's at 7 mana. You know what? I will experiment with it just for fun, but man, I don't think the 1 mana is really gonna be the biggest thing for this card. If it wasn't only this round, it would be better. Well, oh yeah, sure. If it wasn't only this round, oh hell yeah, yeah, why not? Petty Officer. All right. Petty Officer gets +1 health. This is an absolutely massive change. It's hard to explain how big of a change this is. This is huge. This is like an enormous change. This is a really, really big buff. So the thing you guys have to understand with how big this change is, first of all, I think this card is sort of, you could air quotes OP here. I think this is a healthy change, and it makes this card very, very good, right? The biggest thing to understand is like balance. Not everything wants to be balanced the same, right? This is the kind of card that is healthy by being very strong. So Petty Officer. Let's evaluate this. It looks like a small change, right? +1 health. And we've looked at some other changes. You know, Darius got +1 health. The same exact change. And I said this change was completely and utterly meaningless. So, like, what's going on here? This is like the polar opposite end of the spectrum. Well, a couple of things. Actually, like 4 different things at once. The first thing is that Darius was a card that was kind of like only fringe, where Petty Officer was already seeing like multiple competitive decks, right? So the difference of like a buff to a solid card versus a buff to like a sort of fringe card, you know, will make a big difference. Secondly, you know, the difference in health, Darius just has like specific circumstances that make this +1 health kind of useless. Whereas Petty Officer is kind of like the opposite, right? Petty Officer is in circumstances where kind of the only thing that's traded down to is going to be, you know, stuff that kills him on 1 health. And that's not just cards like Vile Feast or Make It Rain, but also units. Cards like, I don't know, any 1/1, like Omen Hawk, like literally any 1/1, like literally any 1/1, even Dreg Judges, which is now 1/1. Petty Officer was at the risk of trading down to. Let's evaluate this in the framework of exchanges, okay? It comes down to pros and cons, okay? Let me, because it's a really, really important framework for evaluation. I have to kind of like draw this, right? Okay, so we have a brass scales here. How do you draw scales again? They're kind of like this. They're like this, okay? We've got scales, right? And on one side of the balance, you have like the plus value exchanges, and on the other side, you have the minus value exchanges, right? And you really have to understand that. So Petty Officer is minus value when it hits any 1/1, when it hits, you know, anything that deals 1 damage, which is Vile, Make It Rain, or when it just like kind of just doesn't end up affecting the board, which is usually not going to happen, but in some like late game scenarios, maybe it does nothing. There's basically like, there's a couple of things that make this minus, and then it's plus when it's like, you know, okay, positive exchanges, you know, when you're using the keg for value, you know, that can blow up boards. When you like get a pretty high value 1-drop, you know, you roll a good 1-drop, right? But this completely changes everything, because you guys really have to look at it like this. What trades up to this card now? No, I'm seriously asking you guys. Give me a circumstance. Give me a scenario where Petty Officer trades down. There's a couple. They do exist. What does Petty Officer trade down against? Now, some of you guys are saying Mystic Shot. It's not a trade down. Mystic Shot? Well, it could be. Mystic Shot trades down to Petty Officer. The officer dies, but you have a 1-drop or a powder keg for free. Usually a 1-drop, unless you can use the powder keg. This wins to Mystic Shot, right? That's a big deal. Even though it dies to it, it still wins to Mystic Shot. That's huge. House Spider? Yeah. There's cards like House Spider or cards like Laurent Protege that can trade up to this. Avros and Sentry? Yeah, I would say Avros and Sentry probably trades up as well. These are all good points. Those are 3 examples of like where this can trade down, but like it's important to understand just like how few at this point those are, right? Like compared to what it was before. This card is so reliably, because that's the thing about this, like this +1 health. That's the thing about this +1 health, is that when you're looking at it like this, it's not just that these scales, you know, go up, but they're also like, these situations turn into situations where it's a good trade for Officer. And like, that's a really, really big swing. This card just starts blowing out exchanges, and it has a really, really hard time trading down. Like, there's only a few things that can possibly trade up with this card. And it's good. So Petty Officer is a really strong card. Now, why is this good for the game? Because Petty Officer represents A, an underutilized region for the most part, Bilgewater. B, an underutilized archetype, which is like the powder keg archetype. C, powder kegs are a really interesting concept, but almost by design have to be packaged with A, strong cards, and B, cards that have the flexibility to not be always kegs to actually see play. Like Petty Officer is a nice way to like shoehorn kegs into the concept of existing in the metagame, which is cool. Kegs incentivize like really healthy play patterns, right? So yeah, Petty Officer is going to see a lot of play. It's a big buff. This is now just a really good 3-drop, and it's great. The Yoink package, finally. Steal from deck cards. So now they have reworded the keyword to nab. And nab draws from the bottom of the deck rather than the top. So this does a couple of different things. Mostly, it's a buff to Freljord. These cards no longer counter Freljord interactions that buff from the top, specifically those being cards like Omenhawk and cards like Avaros and Trapper that put a valuable card on the top. This is probably a good change. I want to make one really big thing, one big point here, which is that because these cards cannot draw champions, Starlit Seer and Ash 2. Yeah, I should mention Starlit Seer and Ash 2. Yes, there are a lot of Freljord stuff. Avaros and Outriders, I'm not going to mention Avaros and Outriders. But there's one big buff to these cards, which is that drawing from the top has always given your opponent more odds of drawing into champions. This is undertouched, but really significant. Like, the math behind it is much more significant. It's not like a minor thing. When I do a black market merchant and then I play 2 pilfered goods, right? And I draw 5 cards from the opponent's deck, my opponent is literally 6 times as likely to top deck a champion than if I hadn't done that. That is kind of I'm not 6 times. Like, that's really insane. That's slightly rounded math, but that's like a big deal. Like, so why is it 6 times? Because these cards can't draw champions. So when you draw a bunch of cards off the top, if there's a champion anywhere in the top 6 cards, they will draw it next turn. Because these cards draw off the top, but they have to skip any champions they see. It's more than 6, but okay. It's slightly more than 6. Yes. I know. The math is but it's about 6, okay? That's a really huge deal. And that doesn't always matter. Some decks don't really care, but for the most part, decks do like drawing into their champions on average, especially as you hit these like middling turns, like where these Yoinkov chains are going off turn 5, turn 6. The fact that my opponent is basically going to be at like a 40% chance to draw Sejuani literally on the top of their deck on turn 6, that's strong for them. And that's weak for me because of that. So that is something to take into account. It is overall minor. But it is something that like will matter long term, right? So even though Nab draws from the bottom, which does make it less oppressive against stuff like, you know, the Freljord stuff, it, apart from that circumstance, is stronger, right? Okay. A bit. Black Market Merchant loses 1 health. Overall, I don't think that changes too much. It definitely will matter. This card can be like picked now, so usually you were playing it on the same turn as your Pilfered Goods anyway, but sometimes like you can pick off a Black Market Merchant and hurt their Pilfered Goods from being able to draw your cards. So that's it. They just made it a nab keyword, and then they reduced this health by 1. So how do I feel about these cards? Well, I feel like Freljord is going to be really good, and this change is part of the reason for that. I think Freljord is going to be actually like almost stupid good. We'll see. I'm a little worried about the brown buff in particular. It's very possible that I'm just being, you know, paranoid. I hope so. But in conjunction with like a couple of other things coming down, I think Brown might have his time. Like, Brown's gonna be very well positioned. Everything else in Freljord feels good. Brown's gonna hit like competitive experimentation at a time where he hasn't seen competitive experimentation since Fury of the North didn't exist as a card. Brown plus Fury is a big combo. Like, and most importantly, cards that were seeing cuts from deck, Omenhawk was seeing cuts from decks. And that is partly because of these Yoink packages, which these no longer counter. Avaros and Trapper was seeing cuts from decks. A lot of them. In fact, that card was basically not played at all. And that's mostly because of these Yoink cards. It seems like a niche case, right? It seems like, well, that doesn't really make that much sense. I mean, like, what are the odds that I'm going to play a trapper, and then like the opponent will be a yoink deck, which most opponents aren't even yoink decks, and then they draw the card at the right time for the trapper. Like, what are the odds of all of that? Not as low as you think. That will happen in, this is like a very broad estimate, probably like 2% of ladder games. Like, and that sounds low, but when you're talking about that swing of value, when you play a trapper and your opponent draws your 0 mana 5/5 instead of you, that's like a ridiculous swing in your game. Like, that's such a crazy swing in your game that even when it happens in a small percent of games, that will like bleed into net win rate in a really big way, right? In a really, really, really big way. So I do feel as if Freljord might be, this might be the season of Freljord. We will see. We will see. There's gonna be like, it's gonna be so common, man. It's gonna be so common. Turn 1 Omenhawk into like turn 4 Braum that got buffed as like a 2/6. Super, super, super common. You're gonna see this all the time, I think. It's possible that the new Braum is something I'm kind of overrating. You know, the 1 cost does matter, for sure. But just like, you're always getting a free Mighty Poro. That's so big, dude. Ah, it's so huge, man. So yeah, I am a little scared of Freljord. I am a little scared of Freljord. Actually. For the most part, I think most of these changes are actually kind of like non-consequential. A lot of these are like really minor buffs to weak things. Like Ren Shadowblade, really minor buff to something weak. She Who Wanders, really minor buff to something weak. Poro Herder, I don't know if this is a buff. I mean, you guys are pointing out that Braum comes out on turn 4, so this kind of didn't want to compete with Braum anymore. Yeah, that's true. And I guess I can consider it a buff because of that. But, so yeah, this is another minor buff that won't matter. This is another minor buff that won't matter. Captain Fron is a minor buff that could matter, actually. This is a minor buff that won't matter. This is a minor buff that could matter. Genevieve is actually, like, pretty big. I have a hard time feeling like Jinx is going to be well positioned in this meta, but hey, Jinx decks will actually not feel as bad. Like, this will matter if you want to play Jinx, right? Anivia has a hard time mattering. Darius has a hard time mattering. So, for the most part, this patch is actually changing, like, a fairly small amount of things, right? I think that Freljord is going to be stronger. Petty Officers and Nuts card, we're going to see that a lot. I think people will experiment with the Harrowing, and there's actually a chance this could hit decks, you know? You never know. And people will experiment with Jay Medarda, and while I don't have high hopes for Jay Medarda, there is actually a chance he could hit decks. The Lee Sin board, okay, interesting. I will say, a board is as good as the music. Without seeing like how the music is, we just don't know if we're going to like it. Then there's Guardians. There's a little cat thing that's playing with the laser. Kind of cute, I guess. Von Yip. Personality devious. Hobby unregulated experimentation. So this is the cat. Apparently Von Yip like turns into a cat, which makes sense because when you play Von Yip, there's like a meowing noise. Von Yip is the cat, not the guy. Oh, wait! Wait, what? Von Yip is the cat? I thought it was like the kind of like bald guy. Ooh. Okay, wait a second. Oh, shit. Oh, you know, that explains a lot, actually. Okay. Oh, God. Oh, man. I had no... Okay, card backs. 3 new card backs, Blind Monk, Title Trickster, Bounty Hunter. Honestly, I will say, card backs are kind of lame. Like, emotes are sweet. You know, you can do a lot with emotes. Even emotes that I consider to be low tier, some people like. You know, there's personality in emotes, and the boards are cool. You know, for the most part, I think the coolest thing about boards is like the music, because like just being able to like, you know, some of the music can really just be great and change that experience a lot. I love the fact that these boards change music. The cards themselves are like, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but like, I can't look at these cards. There's not going to be a card back design where I'm going to look at it and I'm going to be like, oh yeah, oh that's doing it for me. Like that, I can't imagine what that would even look like, you know? It's just like, card backs, okay. Emotes. So, now this is where we must evaluate emotes based on nothing but the still image. And that's hard. That's hard. Because emotes are all about the animation, baby. So, let us try to evaluate what these sentiments are trying to convey. Fizz is trying to be a kind of cheeky bastard. He's got like a shit-eating grin kind of thing, right? He's kind of like, he's like stifling a kind of laugh, right? I believe. I've never really been good at like human emotion. When I look at faces, sometimes I just can't tell. But correct me if I'm wrong. Cytheria looks very concerned. It's sort of like it's like the Teemo where you're like nervous, anxious, I believe. Now again, I'm gonna need you guys to double up on this here because I'm actually not sure. Cytheria is kind of like a Teemo dupe. Well, I will say, it's more like Ezreal than Teemo. I will say, it's more like Ezreal than Teemo. Because Teemo's like, you're praying on the top, right? It shows the deck, and you're drawing the deck, and it's like praying, and it's like, oh god, what's on top of my deck? Whereas Cytheria is like Ezreal, where you can use it if there's something like, you know, something's about to happen. And then there's Vi, which is representing, I believe, boredom? Which, as far as I know, is an alt gangplank. Cytheria is more of a yikes emote. I really don't read yikes in Cytheria, but like I said, I'm really not good with expressions. It's an eye roll. Yeah, but it kind of looks like boredom, right? Like she's kind of leaned on her thing. Is it just an eye roll? Vi for I don't care. I will say, these emotes aren't amazing. I'm not in love with these emotes. I'm not like, There's nothing about these that are like, yeah. Fizz is S tier. Fizz is alright. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the animation yet. At the end of the day, with emotes, there's a fine line. You need your emotes to be low expression so that they are a higher degree of irony. Fizz is like medium expression here. I would say actually that Fizz leans towards high expression. I think Fizz is like a noob trap. I actually don't think I like the Fizz emote. Every time, okay, I will say, think about it. Every time that there's a new high expression emote, everyone says they're going to be good, right? You remember when Yasuo came out and everyone was like, oh god, Yasuo emote's going to be so good? But think about it. How many of you guys are actually still using the Yasuo emote? High expression emotes are just too unironic. And a lot of them seem so good in theory, but then you just don't actually like using them. And that's how I feel about the Fizz emote. I don't think any of these three are ones I'm going to be using.